Tired of seeing those annoying flies swarming your cows each summer? Today we are going to learn how to prevent that. Hey, I'm Shaye and I host the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Today we are visiting with Jonathan Wells from the Cargill Animal Nutrition Team about various fly control strategies and how to know which one is best for your operation. We specifically talk about the Altosid Bolus that is really changing fly control as we know it, so it's a really interesting conversation. Jonathan has over 18 years of experience in the beef industry, both as a professional and a cattle producer himself, and he's located in the southeast portion of the state. He really has a lot of practical knowledge to share, and I really enjoyed the conversation as a producer myself, so I know you will too. Remember that you can find this podcast on YouTube, and be sure to hit subscribe on whichever platform you are listening on. But with that, let's visit with Jonathan. Well, good morning, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today, and I'm excited to talk about fly control because I know when I think about summer pastures and when I see flies on the cows, there's nothing more annoying than that. So thanks for joining us.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So just to get started, why is a good fly control program or fly control management so important when we're looking at the profitability of cattle ranches across the country, really?
Well, when you think about fly control and specifically the horn fly in general, it is by far the number one nuisance that beef cattle on pasture experience out there on pasture. When you look at current market values, I mean, you're talking about $2 billion per year in annual losses. And when we visually see those flies on the cows, it's easy to see the nuisance and the head swatting and the swishing of the tails. But what a lot of people don't realize is what is actually going on beyond that within those animals. So things as much as the horn fly being a vector for the spread of, say, mastitis in heifers or the spread of anaplasmosis, of course, has that from a disease spreading standpoint. But then from an actual profitability, how it affects actual weight gain and the overall stress of the animal. That effect of weight gain just has a tremendous economic impact that affects the industry far beyond just the overall stress or the nuisance that we observe visually looking at that fly on the cow.
Okay, so you've already touched on some of those negative impacts when there's a bad fly year or poor control strategies. You talked about some of those diseases and then that efficiency component because cows are putting their energy elsewhere to swat at those flies. Is there anything else you want to touch on for some of those negative impacts?
So when you look at the negative impact in general, I think the first thing that comes to my mind as a whole is just we sell cattle by the pound. And so when we think of that negative impact, the negative impact on performance is where my mind goes more times than not. And so when you look at what that fly does, there's several things that happen. From a heart rate standpoint, you have an animal that has good fly control to an animal, say, with 500 flies on her side. You have the heart rate go from about 76 beats to over 100 beats per minute. That's a significant increase just in heart rate, 30% increase there. But when you look at past that, so things like the amount of water that the animal consumes increases. But even though that amount of water intake increases, the amount of urinary output is much, much larger. Like when you look at the urinary loss, it's triple the amount of urine output when an animal has, say, 500 flies versus fly control. So that urinary loss of nutrients is huge. But the single biggest thing, when you look at nitrogen retention, so the nitrogen being the building block for proteins and truly the average daily gain or lean muscle development, you're looking at retention numbers there that are 30% less. Meaning it's impossible to have the same level of average daily gain when you're not retaining that nitrogen going in. So you look at average daily gain differences of about 15%. That's about a third of a pound a day. In this market, that's over $1, what a third of a pound's worth. So it's hard to overlook just that impact in terms of the average daily gain component, what just the horn fly load on the cow does to us.
Yeah, that is very impactful, whether that's for the cow's performance, the calf's performance. I mean, it both that both really matters to producers. So what are some solutions that you recommend for producers or you see as effective? Because I know us personally, we've tried, the Poron, the oilers, we've tried mixing things in mineral. I mean, what are some of those solutions that you recommend?
Yeah, so like you said, the more common or things that you see all the time are topical insecticides, whether it be permethrin, pyrethroid, organophosphate-based topicals, ear tags going in. All of those things are targeted at killing the adult fly. So you already have a fly that is an adult that is already affecting the animal, trying to knock those back. That's where, certainly we can have control that helps, but that's also where we're running into a lot of resistance too. And so from a control standpoint, certainly works as far as you have the adult flies and you're able to knock back that population. But you mentioned something a minute ago about the feed-throughs too. So feed-throughs, probably the most popular, most widely used on that would be the Altosid IGR, which is the S-methoprene molecule. A difference between that versus your topicals is the S-methoprene or the Altosid IGR is actually targeting, basically breaking the life cycle of the fly. So it works through the manure of the animal so that when the animal drops a manure patty, the flies then land on that patty within a matter of seconds after it comes out to try to lay their eggs. The way that feed through works is it basically prevents the eggs within that manure from being able to mature into adult flies. So you effectively break that life cycle. The benefit of that there is you don't run into the resistance issues because you're not physically killing the adult fly. You're just breaking that life cycle in the middle by utilizing the Altosid. So when you look at a good fly control program, it does take a combination of different things. So it's not that you still wouldn't want to look at things like an adult, insecticide at times, but a feed-through method is one of those that's just been proven. It's been on the market for over 40 years, and we're not seeing resistance with that. We're seeing good control by utilizing that Altosid IGR.
What is the life cycle of a hornfly from when those eggs are laid to when they're that mature adult that's being pesky?
When you think about the actual life cycle of the fly, the biggest thing that is kind of that affects us there is you have a fly that's able to be a nuisance for basically a month's period of time, once it emerges. So just because you go through and you treat your cattle today, if there's an egg in the manure that is not treated and able to hatch into an adult, then you'll have that fly be able to hatch. And even though you have maybe just sprayed or treated those cattle today, if that fly emerges within a matter of days, it may or may not be able to be killed by that insecticide, so you restart the problem again.
So you've already kind of explained what the Altosid IGR XRB is, and that's just a feed-through option?
So just a minute ago we were kind of talking, I was mainly speaking specifically on just the Altosid molecule in general that can come through the feed-through. But something that we're in our third year now, you just mentioned the Altosid XRB. The XRB is an extended release bolus that releases the S-methoprene or that Altosid molecule, but the way that it works is different in the sense that your feed through, like you had mentioned that you've done there at home on your operation, it has to be administered daily through intake of some form of feed or mineral ingredient. What the Altosid XRB does is it is an actual orally administered bolus that you apply to the cow at the start of fly season. And the benefit of the bolus is it slowly releases. It resides in the rumen of the animal to slowly release over the period of about 195 days. And so essentially when you apply that Altosid extended release bolus, you're getting a season-long control of those horn flies with a single application. The benefit of that over, say, your feed-through is once you put it in, it's in the animal. That means a lot because, we're all busy. And if, say, you have your Altosid in your free choice mineral, it's very easy to potentially not check your mineral feeders for a few days and you run out of mineral. And say you don't have any mineral at home, well, then you go to your retailer. What happens if your retailer's out, of that mineral with the Altosid too? So there's several factors that can line up. And the biggest challenge there is you can have done a perfect job keeping your fly control mineral out for 2 to 3 months, but you have a lapse of 2 weeks. All of that work you've done the first half of season to kind of keep those flies reduced, kind of goes for waste, because you've got a new population of flies that have hatched. Where with the extended release bolus, once you apply it, it's in the animal for 195 days until it slowly degrades itself. So just a tremendous tool that can be in our producer's toolbox to be able to have a way to control horn flies through the growth regulation, not letting those flies actually become adults.
What I'm impressed with is that it's 195 days. Does the effectiveness of that bolus diminish as, that time period kind of lapses? So is there more protection from it, or is it more effective on the front end compared to the back end, or what are you guys seeing there?
That's a really good question. So when you think of a bolus, oftentimes, the degradation rate is why they work and how they work. But when you look at why this is, it's in the name, the extended release bolus. So the bolus, when you first put it in, is 80 grams. And that 80-gram bolus releases a 1.5% S-methoprene solution. So when you put it in that 80 gram, you have the surface area of the bolus. As that surface area decreases over the 195 days, so it slowly degrades, the actual rate at which the S-methoprene is released actually increases, so that you maintain that constant level of Altosid being released, so that you do have an effective rate of Altosid actually getting into the manure. Because if that Altosid, if it did not have that extended release technology, kind of to your point, you would end up at a point where, yes, you would put this in, but is it actually going to be an effective rate to actually control your hornfly species? And so we actually, during the development of this, we actually utilized in our study animals were actually fistulated steers that basically we pulled the bolus out every 30 days to measure the weight of the bolus and the amount that was being released to ensure that we were having proper degradation of that bolus, so that we were able to confidently say that we had the degradation rate and the release of the S-methoprene at a level that would be effective in the manure.
Now, is this something for producers who are spring calvers and they're putting pairs out? Does it need to be administered to both the cow and the calf then?
Yeah. So another really good question there. So the in general, the flies like laying their eggs in a cow manure patty. When you think of the consistency of the mature cow manure versus the calf manure, some pretty big differences there. But when you're looking at it, it really comes down to the weight of the calf. So a spring-born calf, say you have a calf that's born in March, that's not something we're going to put it in at the beginning of fly season. The calf needs to be, the recommended deal there is between, above 300 pounds and under 660 pounds would be a half bolus, where a mature cow would get a full bolus. So I see more of the spring time of year being if you have, say, the fall calving cow, and you're going through doing your spring work and maybe your preg checks on that fall calving cow, being able to administer the bolus to that fall calving cow then, and then being able to go back and, if there is a 350 to 400 pound calf on the side of mama, going ahead and administering that calf, because when you think of the course of fly season, that calf will be bumping up 600-700 pounds, by the end of summertime, early fall. So you want to, it really depends on kind of where you're at. So your question specifically on the spring calving cows, it would mainly just be your mama cows that you'd be looking at there. Mm-hmm. Your fall calvers would be where we'd look at the full bolus in the mama and then the half bolus in the calf on her side.
Okay. Well, and so your fall calving comment kind of answered my next question. I was curious if there were any restrictions for, if you had your gestating cows, etc., and it doesn't sound like there are, or can you kind of clarify that? So
in terms of the safetiness and the utilization of the Altosid XRB, it can be on lactating, non-lactating beef and dairy cattle. It's approved for both. When you look at the effectiveness or issues in terms of beef cattle, there's none, as far as anything that you have to be aware of there. One kind of side note, just at the administering of the bolus, you definitely want to make sure you're using a stainless steel applicator gun, because you certainly don't want to risk, scratching the trachea or anything like that and causing some form of secondary, type issue. But from the actual bolus itself and the S-methoprene release, there is no issues that you need to be worried about in terms of lactating, non-lactating, gestating. Biggest thing would just be making sure that you're getting, the right size bolus. You definitely don't want to put a full bolus in a small calf. That's why you do the half bolus. So just little things like that.
Are there any other application tips or nuances that producers should be aware of outside of, you just offered the stainless steel applicator? Is there anything else?
The single biggest thing, when it comes to applying a bolus, a lot of people haven't done it. Just you look at the way that we administer and the way that we handle our cattle. The bolus is one of those things that, transparently, I had never put a bolus in until I used Altosid XRB myself. So you definitely learn, the technique that works best for you. Single biggest thing, making sure you have your animal properly restrained in a good chute. That, of course, is the number one thing, because you are going to have to physically put that into the cow. Just a little side tip, when you actually administer the bolus, you got to make sure you go up and over the top of the tongue. It's not like a oral dewormer where you hook the side of the mouth. You got to make sure you go up and over the tongue. As long as you go up and over the tongue, it's a pretty simple process. I've kind of took some videos and kind of timed, what it would take, and anywhere between 10 and 15 seconds is kind of the average time for me. And I will tell you transparently, I am the least coordinated person on the planet. So if I could do that, I feel good. But the biggest thing is just up and over the top of the tongue. And then now that we're in our third year of the actual bolus in the field, we have 2 full seasons, kind of under us. And one of the other things that, kind of just a tip that I've learned between season 1 and season 2, and then now going into season 3, is when you administer the bolus, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and do some form of topical insecticide at the same time, because even though you may think that there aren't many flies out there yet, there are, generally speaking, probably flies already there if you're thinking about putting the bolus in. And by going ahead and kind of knocking out whatever existing fly population is there at the start, it helps us kind of have a level playing field for when we actually do administer that bolus, not to be fighting against a fly that could have another 3 weeks of life left in them.
Well, that's a great tip. Does it matter which topical a producer would go with? Is there any interactions between the bolus and the topical that producers need to be aware of?
No. So that's the beautiful thing about Altosid in general, is it is just a pass-through in the animal and only works through the manure on the actual egg that the hornfly lays. So there is no actual effect that it has on the beef cow herself. So any type of topical, whether it be your pour-on dewormers or insecticides, or if you still continue to utilize your fly tags, no effect there. And kind of the other little side note there to also kind of point out that kind of ties into this too, the Altosid is also approved for all IMI marketing programs too. So there's no, in terms of negative effects in terms of the cow, as well as how you want to potentially market those cattle or calves too. You don't run into any negatives there.
So Jonathan, one question I have as a producer myself is, when I go out and I'm looking at pastures, I sometimes wonder, do I have proper fly control? Could I do better? I'm not sure what that threshold is, or really what good fly control should look like sometimes. Can you help explain some of that?
I like that question a lot. So when you drive up to a group of cows during the middle of summer, when you drive up, especially if it's kind of in that later part of the afternoon and the cows are starting to ease back out and start grazing after a hot summer day, when you kind of drive up, you can look across the group of cows, and when you see those cows spread out across the field grazing, that's normally a very good indicator that they're not under a heavy fly load. When you watch those cows while they're spread out grazing, if you don't notice them constantly swishing their tail and slinging their head back over their shoulders trying to swat some flies off for a few seconds of relief, those are all just visual images that we can see, and we've all seen as producers too, the nuisance and the stress that those flies put on those cows. If we drive up to that group of cows and it's 95 degrees outside and they're wadded up in a tight ball, they're not wadded up in that tight ball because they're cold and they're trying to stay warm. They're doing that to try to keep the flies off their sides. They're huddled up. So just the actual behavior of the cows themselves is a really good indicator of your fly load. So it doesn't require going up and physically trying to count the flies and look at the flies. Watching the animals, watching how they're actually out grazing and how they're working is one of the biggest things that I look at. But then when you do kind of drive up to the cows and look closer, The other thing that is just human nature is we are so prone to find the animal that maybe has more flies than another, and we're like, oh, this isn't working. But then we go look at another cow, and you don't even see a fly on her. And so the thing we got to remember is we're looking at the average of the group and trying to make sure that we're observing the average of the population and how that fly load is affecting the average of the group there. So just the grazing behavior and the behavior of the animals is such a big thing for me when I drive up and visualize a group of cows.
Okay. You have cattle too. Do you want to share some of your experiences with how you handle fly control?
When you look at how I manage cattle right here at my house versus the pasture I have up the road, two completely different scenarios. One scenario up the road has fescue-based pasture. One scenario here at home doesn't have fescue-based pasture. So several different things can come into play. But on the pasture that I have up the road that is a fescue-based pasture, I'm actually utilizing one of our products that we have for endophyte management, which is a fescue EMT mineral. That's actually a 5-ounce intake. So according to EPA standards, we can't run Altosid IGR through that mineral. So in order for me to get Altosid into those cattle, the Altosid XRB was a great tool for me personally because I could utilize the endophyte management technology mineral that I wanted to use on those cattle with the fescue EMT while being able to still have the Altosid. So on those cattle, I was the very first year, that would have been one of the first groups in North Georgia that actually had, Altosid Bolus applied to them. So, and it was, going into it fresh, hadn't seen it personally in Georgia. And so being able to see it work was huge for me. And I'll tell you one of the take-home messages for me, everybody has seen what the fly load on a bull looks like in a pasture. You will always be able to see the flies on the bull. He's going to have them. And when you're driving through the pasture and it's late June and you see the bull standing there and you can visually count the individual flies on them, you know something's pretty good happening out there in that field. And I ran that group of cattle in kind of intentionally without any topical of any kind. So no pour-on dewormer, no insecticides, no ear tags. The only thing those cattle had was the Altosid XRB because I personally needed to know what kind of results am I going to see or are people that I'm working with going to see when they utilize the Altosid XRB in their herds.
All right. Well, I appreciate you sharing your personal experience and really deep diving this conversation, I should say, because we've covered a lot about fly control. And as we wrap up today, if there's one thing you want listeners to remember, what do you want that to be?
So for me, I think what I just want everybody to think about is with a pound of gain being worth what it is in this market, can we really afford to let the horn fly be taking all that added profitability away from us when there's tools like the Altosid XRB available to us that we can apply one single time and have season-long control of horn flies? So that's what I'd probably like people to sit back and think about. Can we really lose $1 a day in performance just to a fly?
All right. Well, that is great food for thought. Jonathan, thank you for joining me today. Folks, if you are listening, there will be a link to what we talked about today in the description or show notes. Additionally, any other resources mentioned today will always be in the description. And if they're not, because I'm human and sometimes I forget, you can send me an email. Just go to my website, casualcattleconversations.com, and say what you're interested in or looking for, and I'll help you find it. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating or review, and better yet, share it with a friend who would find this information valuable, because podcasts still grow best by word of mouth. But with that, happy ranching, folks.